Hi, my name is Karin Jones, and I'm an artist working primarily in jewelry, but I also work with other craft media. And I'm born and raised in Vancouver, and I'm still based here. So the exhibition that's up right now is a series of 8 neck pieces that I created using traditional jewelry techniques, but using non-traditional materials. So I've used some materials such as steel and organic materials like corn and human hair. And I've incorporated them into these steel neck pieces as an expression of African identity as a woman of African descent living in North America. So when I first started making this work, I was thinking about identity as something that we wear, and whether it's something that we can choose to wear, that we put on and take off, or whether it's something that's somehow attached to us by the identities that society places on us. And so for me, as a woman of African descent in North America, I feel that the narrative of slavery is a really strong one, and it's one that I've always felt through pop culture and literature, something that's so strong, it's almost always attached to us. So by making these neck pieces, I was starting to question whether we chose to wear that history with a sort of pride, because we are proud somehow that our people have survived that. But then there's also sort of a questioning of whether that's something that's been placed on us. And I started to wonder if I was making these pieces because I was thinking about the relief that would come from taking them off, rather than the idea that I actually wanted to wear this history. So the first material that I thought of using for this series was steel, because I was thinking about the implements of restraint that were used during slavery, like shackles and sort of neck restraints that I'd seen photos of. So that was important for me to use steel for that. And I also really worked hard to weather the steel to make it look like something historic that had maybe been dug up or found somewhere. And the other materials, some of the organic ones, like the corn, has kind of a more personal, emotional meaning for me. But also it has that, the connotation of, like thinking about the fields and thinking about agriculture, and so different contexts in which slaves would have been working, and also as like a foodstuff that's quite cheap and often is thought of. I've heard Europeans and British people talk about it as sort of a low food that's only fit for animals. So there's sort of a class thing going on there as well. And also just thinking about how would you adorn yourself if you really had nothing? Like if you had no access to precious, beautiful materials, and would you be looking around for things with which to adorn yourself that could be quite beautiful in their own right? And even, especially, I've used a type of corn called hominy, which is these really large kind of white kernels, which would have been a staple in the American South and still is. But I also saw the similarity between those kernels of hominy and the cowrie shells that you see in a lot of African art and jewelry. So I was thinking a little bit about if you didn't have access to the things that were precious to you back in your home country from which you were taken, would you look around and adorn yourself with the things that are around you? And not that I would suggest that enslaved people would actually do this, but just as a way of imagining that sort of poverty and oppression, and how to find beauty, just small ways of finding beauty in a life that would be really not, that would be often full of ugliness. I also wanted to talk a little bit about the use of hair in my jewelry, because that was actually that was the major starting point for me questioning identity and starting to think about race. I had become aware probably about 7 or 8 years ago. I became aware of the practice of people wearing human hair extensions. And I thought somehow that idea that that you could wear another person's hair, somehow that made me think about a lot of things, and it had sort of an emotional impact for me, especially hearing that a lot of hair extensions are from women in India who go to temples and shave their heads, and then the temple turns around and sells their hair for Western markets. And so that was really the starting point that actually got me thinking about identity, because I started to think about how many women of African descent were buying those long straight hair extensions in an attempt well, there's debate whether it's actually an attempt to mimic Western beauty standards, but to me it's fairly clear that there's a strong element of that. And so when I started thinking about hair, and because I'm a jeweler, I started thinking about how hair was used in jewelry in Victorian times. It was woven into really intricate sort of ropes and weavings that were then set into gold, and people would wear a loved one's hair as a piece of jewelry. So that was something that I started working with. Was trying to recreate these kind of Victorian pieces with intricately woven, commercially available hair. But somehow that didn't feel quite what I was trying to get at in terms of like emotionally and conceptually. So I put that aside a little bit. But then when I started working with this series, I really wanted to actually include some African hair, and I was lucky enough that several people donated dreadlocks to me that they had cut off, and so that hair came into the pieces in a way that's very different from how Victorian hair jewelry was worn, but it still has an element of, you know, like there's somehow a tribute to those people, and it brings something personal and an actual part of people into the jewelry. So for most of my career, I have worked mostly in jewelry, and I've done more traditional jewelry mediums like gold and silver. But somehow early in my career, when I was first learning to make jewelry, my teachers were always trying to instill in us that jewelry is an art form as well, and it can carry ideas just the same as any other art form. So when I first started out, I tried to do that with my work. I tried to embed some ideas in it, but I found that because jewelry is often only shown in sort of a commercial context, people would overlook the ideas and just be thinking about whether it was pretty or whether they'd want to wear it or not. So all my life I've kind of wanted to do a bit more with it, but felt limited by the venues that I could show jewelry in. So with this work, one of my goals was really to present it in a way that that would break down some of the barriers that existed to showing jewelry in an art gallery setting, because I feel that when people come into a contemporary art gallery, they're ready to actually look at the work and think about the ideas in it. I knew that one of the barriers was always that a lot of galleries don't have necessarily any display cases or mounts for the jewelry to be shown in. And so I thought, okay, I have to find a way to mount the jewelry, make it easy for the gallery to see it as work that they can install fairly easily. And so that was one of the first challenges, was finding a way to mount it. And then also, because of my metalsmithing background, I could create these metal brass mounts like you see in museums. But I also knew that it couldn't be just a mount, that I could make something that holds the jewelry that also speaks to the message that I was trying to convey. So I thought by putting them on these black panels, it sort of alludes to the history of painting, because they're actually painting panels that have been stained black. But it could also, it sort of denotes an absence. So you can think of the absence of the body when you're looking at the piece, which is hung at neck level. And it also is very symbolic of the absence of African people in the history of Western art. So I felt like all of those things kind of came together. I knew that the practical elements had to also work with the conceptual elements in the work. I think for sure it's important for people to know the history of slavery in North America, which I think most people are aware of. I think it's great that there are people now that are working hard to expose the fact that Canada had slavery as well in its history. But I don't feel that element of it is as important to my work, because my work is more about the image that's created, the identity that's created that often gets attached to African people in North America, even if they weren't descendants of enslaved people. So it's more of a general idea of how African people how that history has been created for us in North America, and actually also in South America and the Americas in general. Mm-hmm.